Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki a hau ti he Māori ora, behold the breath of life, e na mana, e na reo, aura rakatira mā tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā te raru e te maru o ka mana whenua, ka te māmoi waitaha, kaitahu no mai haramai. Welcome. I stand under the umbrella of the people of this place, ka te māmoi waitaha and kaitahu, to welcome you here. Ko Waiao, ko Richard Blakey tāka wingua. Who am I? I'm Richard Blakey. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Enterprise. I bring the apologies of Vice-Chancellor Helen Nicholson, who's unfortunately not in Dunedin today. But it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you here tonight to this inaugural professorial lecture to celebrate the promotion of Charles Pigden to the position of Professor. E te rangatira e horaki Professors Palmer, Weber, Ellis and Professor Pigden. Welcome. In manahiri o te otapoti o te teiwai paunamu e te Aotearoa e te hauwei whā. No mai haramai, welcome too. So to visitors here, to those from Dunedin, to friends and colleagues and family of Professor Pigden, to colleagues from the university, to other members of the Dunedin public, visitors from elsewhere, kia ora, and to our former Chancellor, Professor Dr. Somerville, special welcome to you. To those viewing online now or in the future, welcome, welcome, and thrice welcome. I don't have much to say except to acknowledge the importance of these events, which is why we get our gowns on, to recognise and celebrate promotion to the position of Professor, which is the highest academic appointment or promotion for the university. This is not a trivial exercise to reach this point. It requires outstanding leadership and outstanding performance measured at an international level across all three elements of our academic roles: teaching, research and service. We'll have introductions from others about the detail of Professor Pigden. We will leave good time for his lecture. We'll leave time for a vote of thanks, and we'll certainly leave time for us to gather at the staff club afterwards. But I just want to recognise, Charles, on behalf of the university, in particular your leadership in service, leadership in developing and helping develop and maintaining the philosophy, politics and economics programs, and also your service in many ways, but up to and including service on the University of Council. So for those and for your many other contributions, can I please ask you to join me in congratulating you, thanking you and congratulating you for your promotion to Professor. The order of proceedings is now Professors Weber and Ellis will introduce you professionally. You will give your presentation, the vote of thanks, and we'll get to dinner. So I'll now invite Professor Weber to start the introductions of the formal part of proceedings. Thank you very much.
I got a promotion, that's good. Sure. Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm Associate Professor Zach Weber, head of the philosophy program here at Otago, and it's my pleasure, is that right? It's my pleasure to introduce Charles Pigden tonight. I was asked to introduce him as a philosopher, so to say a few words about that. So Charles has been with us since 1988 after graduating Cambridge and then studying in La Trobe, Australia. My experience of Charles as a philosopher is somebody who is warmly, deeply, and enthusiastically committed. So the first time I came to Dunedin was for a conference back when I was a PhD student. And Charles came to my talk, even though I was just a lowly student, and he excitedly and supportively asked really original questions, and I was nervous, and it was a really formative experience to have him there. And then when I came to Otago later as a junior lecturer, Charles sat in on an entire course that I taught, just off his own bat. He was just wanted to sit there, and he gave me lots of, again, really supportive and high-quality questions, and it wasn't always patronizing or coddling. Sometimes it was pretty hard questions, and I appreciated that too. And he gave me lots of positive feedback in writing, which was also useful for confirmation when that came along later. Charles's career is distinctive for having made contributions to an unusually wide range of areas. So most of us philosophers just kind of pick one tree and circle around it for most of our career. Charles has covered the forest. His knowledge is broad and deep, and he has a long record in many parts of philosophy with, as he'll say, a long citation record to go along with it. his breadth of competence is highly unusual. So he's contributed, as we'll hear tonight, to at least three distinct areas. He's worked on the philosophy of Bertrand Russell. He edited a book, Russell on Ethics, in 1999, which won the Bertrand Russell Society Book Award. He wrote a book-length entry on Russell's moral philosophy for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He brought to the world the idea that Russell did serious work on ethics, which was not taken seriously until Charles came along. He is also an expert on the philosophy of conspiracy theories. According to Butter and Knight, he opened up a new set of debates in analytic philosophy by challenging the assumption that conspiracy theories are always mistaken. And that's been going since the 90s and going strong. And although Charles does dabble in many areas, his chief interest is in metaethics. So he's mostly known for having defended the error theory with special interests in Moore and Hume, and the is-ought question, which is the question, can you get an ought from an is? And he's been working on that with a conference on a related topic planned for later this year. That's right. So along with his scholarship, Charles, I say, is an invaluable and distinctive member of the philosophical community, both locally and beyond. He's extremely open and interested in more than just his own work. He listens and actively participates in the work of others. So if you ever give a talk at the Otago Philosophy Seminar, you can expect Charles to be there asking really engaged and entertaining questions that shows that he is interested in all sorts of things. He's also known more widely for contributing comments and discussions online around the world. Charles sets an example for both students and colleagues of what I want to say is the true, pure philosopher. So when we have staff meetings, which tend to be kind of mundane exercises in governance, and we're discussing a scheduling issue, like should we schedule class X before Y, Charles says, let's stop and talk through the philosophical issues. So I say, should we schedule X before Y? And Charles says, well, would that inadvertently suggest the wrong historical relationship between Hobbes and Hume, or show that the modal logic S5 is not really correct for necessity, because students shouldn't be taught that? For Charles, it's always the right time to stop and think through the philosophical ideas that brought us here in the first place, and I find that deeply and genuinely impressive, that Charles has never lost his spark or genuine enthusiasm for philosophy. He does it every minute of every day, and we are all the better for it. So when I first met Charles when I was a PhD student at, I think, where we're going to have the reception later, Charles said to me, I'm a pretty good 5-minute philosopher. There are a lot of philosophers who they can go away and think for a long time and then say something profound. I can go away for about 5 minutes and come back with something pretty good. And I'm here to say that Charles might be a 5-minute philosopher, but he is also a lifetime philosopher, and what he has had to say over his career and tonight is something that most of us would never come up with, even in 5 minutes, but we would be lucky to. So, e mihi ana kia Charles, heartfelt congratulations, Professor Pigden.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Blue Ridge te Maunga, ko Potomac te Awa, no Virginia aho. Ko Ellis toko whānau, ko Lisa toko inua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, my name is Lisa Ellis, and I direct the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program here at Otaku Whakaihu Waka. I'll get that right soon. Why am I giving a second introduction to Professor Pigden, you are wondering? Charles founded Otago's PPE program 25 years ago next year. And the decisions he made then and the teaching he has done since have made the Otago PPE program what it is today. It is a collection of people devoted to understanding human beings as they are and laws as they might be. So back in 1999, Charles and his colleagues decided to go all in on interdisciplinarity. PPE students at Oxford can drop a subject after 1 year. Our students are fully qualified in all 3 disciplines. They take our core seminar, and in our core seminar, teams of staff and students interact on difficult questions and often disagree. There are questions like, how real is altruism? What do we really know about what drives economic behavior? Are structural or individual historical events more important in driving revolutions? What are the conditions of successful collective action? And always, every year, will this year's cohort solve the divide and deal collective action dilemma and get away with the chocolate, or do the staff take it home again? This year, the students won, first time in ages. So Charles's team-taught sessions with economist David Fielding have become legendary. And these sessions have continued even after David took up a professorship at the University of Manchester. During COVID, he was nobly zooming in at 4 a.m. his time. And since then, he's been showing up, and we're really grateful. The two of them present the history of political economic ideas together with the latest behavioral economics research, asking whether the political economists of the 18th century were right or not. I would like to deliver some words to Charles from David. David says, I am very sorry that I can't be present at Charles's inaugural professorial lecture, and I wish him all the very best for the occasion. I first met Charles in 2004, when the PPE program at Otago was still in its infancy. He was the program director, and I was the economics department representative. I was initially somewhat skeptical about the potential for the degree to attract many students in a New Zealand university where students already have so much choice. But Charles's efforts have proved this skepticism to be entirely unfounded. The success of PPE at Otago is at least in part because of an intellectual coherence lacked by similar degrees elsewhere, and this coherence is a consequence of the enthusiasm, wisdom, and scholarship that Charles has brought to its design and management. The breadth of his knowledge and scholarship is matched only by his kindness. Whatever reasons Charles has for being good, his goodness is there for all to see. David, those words are so true. I could go on telling stories about Charles's contributions to PPE all night, but that is not why you are all here. So, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Pigden.
There we are. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm pleased to meet you all. Happy to see you. And now I'm going to give my inaugural lecture. Now, I draw your attention to the title, Life and Works, or A Philosopher High and Low. Well, that's obvious enough. The typical encyclopedia entry on a dead philosopher starts off with some such section. And though I am not dead yet, I've probably lived about 3/4 of my life already. Thus, in composing my own encyclopedia entry, or even a preliminary auto-obituary, which is sort of what one does in an IPL when you're my age, I've already had a fair bit of life to work with. So, like many another IPL, this is going to be about my work in the context of my life. Or it's going to be about my work and how I feel about life. But what about A Philosopher High and Low? Well, the title comes from the English translation of Balzac's novel, Splendeur et misère des courtisanes, A Harlot High and Low. Now, just to be clear, I am not equating philosophers with harlots. That's only true of some of them. And again, to be clear, it's emphatically not true of my colleagues in the philosophy department at Otago. I have, in fact, been extremely privileged in my colleagues over the last 35 years, 37 if you count my time here as a postdoc. Not only cultured, passionate, and gifted philosophers, but decent and even outstanding human beings to boot. Indeed, I want to emphasize that they're not just fine philosophers, but have been fine people to work with. I won't say that there have been no tiffs and quarrels over a 35-year period, but they have been few and far between. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that we have been a band of brothers, marred only by a certain deficiency of sisters, a problem that is only just now and not very adequately being rectified. Right? But, you know, you have been, those of you who are still with us, wonderful people to work with over the years. I want to pay tribute in particular to the outstanding leadership of two people. I could list others, but there are two particular people I want to mention. Now, being a leader isn't simply a matter of occupying a managerial role or a role of authority. It's not simply being good at the everyday business of administration and management, though that is not to be sneezed at. It's a matter of using that authority to bring out the best in people and of creating a climate in which people feel encouraged and feel free to give of their best and to live to the top of their talents. And in particular, I want to say, I want to acknowledge Alan. Alan's leadership of the department from 1970 onwards has been outstanding. He took a department which was a sort of good provincial department with usually, one distinguished professor as kind of the star, which is what it was from about 1939, to one in which there are lots of distinguished professors who could reasonably claim to be stars. That is, to a very considerable extent, Alan's achievement. And, I really, it's nice to have those kind words from Lisa about the PPE program, but I want to say that as my successor as director of the program, her leadership has been absolutely outstanding. Those who know Lisa will know that she is a very nice person, really nice. And nice, I'm going to say, in a slightly American way. You can imagine, some picket fence drama, and Lisa will be the person who brings round the basket of goodies to the new neighbors. But with a ferociously brilliant intellect, and also an enormous amount of energy. And the success of the program since she took over has been phenomenal, and it is really, to a very considerable extent, her doing. So I want to acknowledge Lisa's leadership as well as Alan's. Okay, well, that's my shout-outs to my colleagues, but now, if I'm not comparing philosophers to harlots, what's with the high and low? Well, I'm going to do something a bit unusual for an IPL. I'm not just going to tell you about my ideas and why I think they're interesting and important, though I will be telling you about some of my ideas and why I think they're interesting and important. I'm not just going to boast about my successes, though I will boast about some of my successes. Those are the highs. I'm going to talk a bit about the lows. I'm going to discuss some of my failures, not so much as a professional philosopher, but as a citizen in what I have intermittently tried to be, a public intellectual who takes very seriously the academic statutory role as critic and conscience of society. So let's begin at the beginning. I was born in 1956 in the UK, 1/3 of the way through what Thomas Piketty calls les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, 1945 to 1975, when capitalism seemed to be living up to the advertising. It was capitalism tamed, capitalism of the human face, the rough edges have been being rubbed off by the social democratic state. Society was not just getting richer, though it certainly was that, it was becoming more equal and characterized by a greater degree of social mobility. I owe many golden opportunities that life has given me to two things: British and later Aussie and New Zealand social democracy, and secondarily, and much later, this basically comes from my father's success fairly late in life, American capitalism. I also want to talk about a remark made by Ellen Wilkinson, Red Ellen, Minister of Education in the Attlee Labour government of 1945 to 51. She actually died part of the way through this. She made a remark about what the goal of the government in general and of the education policy in particular was. She said, "We want to produce the third program society." Now you might say, what the hell is that? What is the third program society? Well, it's a reference which is now somewhat outdated but can easily be explained. The third program in Britain was what you might call the intellectual/concert program on British radio. And so when she was talking about the third program society, what she meant was a society in which the highest cultural goods are both available to everybody and will be appreciated by everybody. They won't just be confined to a cultural elite. So that was part of the ambition of that government, to give the highest cultural goods not just to the favoured and fortunate few, but to everybody. Now that was perhaps excessively ambitious. I'm not sure that you could say that they produced the third program society, but what they did do is produce some third program people. That is to say, there were quite a lot of people who those institutions brought to the world of culture and gave opportunities via education. And my family, my parents, myself, my brother were given those opportunities by the social democratic state. My parents were working class. My dad was, during the Great Depression, there were times when the only money coming into a 7-person household was the money he was making on his paper round. My mother had to leave school, was told to leave school despite her stellar academic performance, age 16. But they were given opportunities because what was provided to them was the opportunity to retrain. To retrain as a school teacher, in the case of my mother, to retrain as a lecturer at a college of further education, in the case of my father, and that launched their career. My mother was a deputy principal. My father, after working for a while in a college of further education, later got a job with the computing company Sperry Univac and rose to be its international director of education. So, when I was in my late teens, we were actually doing pretty well. But when I was growing up, we were actually living in the upper floor of my grandparents' house, which wasn't as large as the house in which I'm duplicating this with my beloved daughter over there and her husband and my grandchildren. It was much smaller. But the society was a society of hope, a society of progress, a society of increasing opportunity and increasing equality. And that was where I started off. That was my initial experience. And what I kind of took to be normal. Now, a book which meant a lot to me, part of the cultural riches to which I had access, and which I read at about the age of 8 or 9, is a book by Geoffrey Treece, the historical novelist, called This Is Your Century. And what it is a history of the 20th century. It was published in 1965. I must have read it shortly after it was published. This is the closing paragraph. We've already had, the horrors of the 20th century, and now the closing paragraph. If Bismarck were alive today, he would have little call to worry lest the next generation be bored through a lack of problems. In any case, he might well shrug his shoulders and say, it will be your affair now if you are bored. Your fathers and grandfathers have done their best, or you may complain their worst. You carry on from here. Whether you like it or not, I'm afraid, this is your century. You have to finish it. Now, these words, an oration from an imaginary Bismarck, really sunk in and have continued to influence me ever since. The lesson I took away from it was that the state of the world was my responsibility. Not just my responsibility, of course, and obviously there was not much I could do about it when I read this initially at the age of 8. But I did feel then, and I do feel now, that it was my responsibility to do my bit, a World War II expression that had not yet died out, to help make the world a better place, or at least to stop it from getting worse. And this brings me to the big failure, the massive failure that's characterized my life, a failure that isn't just mine, but is the failure of an entire generation. We didn't do a good job with the rest of our century. We messed it up, and we continued to make a mess of the 21st century too. Furthermore, the mess we have made may well end up bringing about a global catastrophe, putting the very existence of our civilization in peril. For the rise of neoliberalism destroyed, wrecked, or at least decimated those social democratic institutions to which I owe so much. We no longer live in the sort of squashed pyramid which those institutions created. We live in a society in which is much less equal, in which power and wealth are concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and in which social mobility has been much reduced. We live in a society in which the effective power of the state to regulate commerce and thus to prevent pollution, including the pollution by greenhouse gases, has been much reduced, not because Parliament is not theoretically sovereign, but because it is very difficult to build majorities for policies that enable Parliament to use its power for the public good. We live in a society in which public institutions such as universities, schools, and hospitals are effectively starved of funds, something I don't need to emphasize very much in the current context. Why? Well, basically because governments don't dare to tax the rich. Now, all this is partly due to the decay of the sense of social solidarity, which made it possible to build those social democratic institutions in the first place, and a failure to articulate and argue for the relevant ideals. And here perhaps I should put my hand up as one of the guilty men. Excuse, when I could have been doing this, though I consider the ideas underlying social democracy to be true and or important, I never found them to be particularly interesting. Well, thank you, Marvin. But I'm not so sure. I thought they were just too obvious to require a sustained intellectual defense. So as an intellectual task, it wasn't interesting, and I think, I went wrong. Now, the failures of my generation may well spell catastrophe for the world, as the neoliberal and post-neoliberal governments currently in power are unlikely to do anything very effective about climate change. And note, the catastrophe is already upon us. The end of the world as we know it may already be beginning. 1.5 is thought to be 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level is thought to be the maximum safe level. Well, in May, the World Meteorological Organization published a report highlighting a 66% likelihood that the annual average global temperature in 2023 to 2027 will be more than 1.5 above the pre-industrial levels for at least 1 year. So 66% that we're going to hit that, right? And a 32% chance that will be the mean temperature. Thus, we may very well have already passed what the Paris Accord suggested was the upper limit of safety. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires that dominate the news are the writing on the wall. Well, how far away is mass starvation or large areas of the world simply becoming uninhabitable? Well, we don't know. We don't know, but these possibilities are looming in the relatively near future. Okay, now I can at least claim some credit for having opposed these developments. I've been doing this on and off for 34 years, but though I have not been an accomplice in my generation's catastrophic failures, I feel acutely that I have not done enough to stop them. I may have done my bit, but I'm not at all sure that my bit was good enough. So for the rest of this lecture, I will weave the story of my political failures with those of my philosophical successes, the life and the work, the lows and the highs. Well, now let's start with two more snapshots from Les 30 Glorieuses, this time both from their dying days. Now, sometime in the early 70s, when I was 15 or 16, I started to read the work of Bertrand Russell. I followed a well-trodden path into philosophy. Many philosophical autobiographies tell the same tale. First, I got interested in Russell's more popular writings. Then I moved on to technical questions such as the issue of whether mathematics can be reduced to logic. Particularly important for me was Russell's autobiography, which showed how one could combine a passionate interest in abstract ideas with an equally passionate commitment to social activism. Perhaps I too could pursue my intellectual interests while doing my bit for the world, as Geoffrey Treece's Bismarck had instructed me to do. Second snapshot from the dying days of Les 30 Glorieuses. In October 1976, I went up to Cambridge, only the second person in my family to have gone to university. There have been many since. I had signed up to the moral sciences, as philosophy is called at Cambridge, though I wasn't sure whether I would like it. History was my backup subject if it turned out that, I wasn't suited to philosophy. By the end of my first term, about the time I turned 20, I decided that I absolutely adored philosophy, that if I possibly could, I wanted to spend the rest of my life thinking about philosophical questions. Well, that life is not over, but I am singularly blessed since I've managed to do this now for 46 years. So I'm a very lucky person. Now, some philosophers speak rather pompously of philosophy as a vocation. If I'm honest, I have to say that for me, it's more like an addiction. I just love thinking about philosophical issues, developing arguments and counter-arguments. Furthermore, because for any intellectual subject X, there is a subdiscipline, the philosophy of X. In the words of Dan Dennett, if you're a professional philosopher, you can read almost any book you like and call it work. That's great, that's a really great thing about being a philosopher. I love that. Philosophy is the interdisciplinary subject par excellence. But being addicted to philosophy is not like being addicted to drugs or sex. It's much more like an addiction to chess, or an addiction to video games, or an addiction to the violin. In becoming addicted, you internalize a range of standards and a set of aims, such as what counts as a good move, or a good argument, or a well-played pizzicato. And aims, as I say. Victory, or the right kind of victory in the case of chess and video games, the perfect performance in the case of the violin, and in the case of philosophy, victory, yes, I do like to win arguments, but more importantly, truth. If you really love philosophy, then you're going to admire clever arguments. You're going to feel bad if your own arguments don't stack up. You are likely to loathe bad arguments and detest intellectual dishonesty in general. and you're likely to have a passionate desire to solve philosophical questions. The philosopher is likely to be what Russell jokingly defined as a pedant, someone who likes his statements to be true. And this is not because the philosopher has a pre-prepared set of statements on which true is to be conferred like some sort of honorific. There is a way the world is, and the true philosopher wants to confine him or herself to statements which correspond to it. At least that's true of the philosophers who are not harlots. But there's a problem with the pursuit of truth. What is true is not always edifying or useful, and what is edifying and even useful may not be true. In that case, the little boy who wanted to do his bit might come into conflict with the young philosopher who wanted to get it right. So, here's kind of a conflict, right? When I first began to study philosophy before going up to Cambridge, I was fascinated by the idea, culled from reading Penguin classics, that moral judgments could be proved. And by proved, I meant proved as true. I didn't imagine some degenerate form of proof, such as what an agent with normal or non-fanatical desires would arrive at, given certain canons of rationality. Morality, I thought, was a matter of fact, and the task was to find what those facts were. A.J. Ayer's famous book, Language, Truth and Logic, high on my Cambridge reading list, came as a shock. People oppressed by an authoritarian or religious upbringing apparently find language, truth, and logic liberating. For me, it was the reverse. The questions that interested me were not just unanswerable, they could not sensibly be asked. Not only were there no moral truths, since moral judgments just expressed emotions, morality was not even an arena for rational debate. I felt that language, truth, and logic was a conceptual prison cutting me off from lush fields of thought, logical positivism, the metaphysics of the censor. Now, that was good for me in a way. I went out and reinvented a number of anti-positivist wheels, and I now regard language, truth, and logic as basically a farrago of fallacies. There were, however, some permanent casualties. My faith in the objectivity of morals was shattered. I was enormously attracted by G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica and found it far more plausible as an account of what moral judgments mean. But positive prejudices remained. I could not believe in the Moorean good. Well, I'm inclined to say I was right on both counts. Moral judgments do not belie their propositional form. They are designed to state facts. Moral judgments deal in moral qualities, in good and bad and right and wrong. To sustain moral truth, we need special, here's the Latin phrase, sui generis, properties of goodness and badness, relations of obligation, etc. In short, a realm of autonomous values. That's what must be if moral judgments are to be true. So Moore is right about what moral judgments mean, but it's metaphysically false. There are no such properties as Moore supposes, hence no such realm. Moral judgments are mostly false. Morality is a fiction, though a necessary one. It's in Plato's phrase, a noble lie. Hence, the perhaps somewhat uninspiring title of my PhD thesis, Nihilism, a Defense. So I'm just going to give you the argument in outline. People might want to ask me about this later. So, non-cognitivism is false. That is to say, moral judgments are propositions, they're not orders, they're not explanations, hence they are either true or false. They're in the true-false game. 2, naturalism is false. Naturalism being the view that moral judgments can be boiled down to or based upon statements of natural fact. 3, there are no such properties, therefore no such realm. Conclusion, moral judgments are systematically false. Now, I should say, a theoretical nihilist such as myself need not be a nihilist or an amoralist in practice. Although in moments of metaethical clarity I believe moral judgments be false, in daily life I can and do participate in the fiction. This is not just a matter of acting in accordance with the dictates of common decency, which is prudent, It's a matter of belief. I believe or make believe that a vast range of moral judgments are true. And this isn't just a case of dry intellectual assent. My experience is tainted with the moral illusion. Good and bad seem to me as real as black and white. So far as the phenomenology of moral goes, my life is much like that of other people. Indeed, maybe more morally charged than with some people. I feel like a rip-snorting moral realist. But my everyday moral beliefs and the feelings and experiences consequent on those beliefs are in flat contradiction to my metaethical theories. I am not just a reluctant, but an inconsistent nihilist. And now a short digression on interdisciplinarity. A big focus of my teaching, though less so perhaps thus far on my research, is the why be moral question. Right? A question that's particularly acute for me, given that for me, being moral involves signing on to a fiction. Now, my answer is partly literary. I discuss the issue in part by considering a range of fictional amoralists and arguing that their lives are empty or unlivable. Three of the amoralists being Nikolai Stavrogin from Dostoevsky's The Devils, and Valmont and Merteuil from Laclos' Les Liaisons Dangereuses. I've been running a successful course on this for about 20 years. But why then? Well, I first got to hear about them when my then girlfriend, and now wife Zina, who was studying French and Russian, used to come back from her Cambridge classes and tell me about all the exciting things that her lecturers and supervisors had been saying. I pride myself on being an interdisciplinary scholar, but what I want to stress is that the right sort of interdisciplinarity is not imposed from above, but arises from below, in the course of conversations in the common room or the cafe, or in my case, the bedroom. So this is a shout out to my wife Zina for, amongst other things, introducing me to the greats of French and Russian literature. One reason that I became the interdisciplinary scholar that I am is that I was lucky enough to fall in love with the right girl, and she with me. Now, here's the thing about my philosophical views. They're not actually very socially beneficial, right? A lot of scholars in the humanities are deeply convinced that their research work isn't just a contribution to culture, but socially useful. Often I think they're deluded. You're not likely to make a contribution to social progress by developing a radical reading of Shakespeare's Richard III, but given the content of my opinions, this was not a delusion that I was likely to share. The idea that morality is a useful fiction is at best socially harmless and at worst mildly pernicious. So if in obedience to my inner Bismarck I was to do my duty and do my bit for society and not just for culture, I did not think I should confine my energies to teaching and research, socially useful as I think teaching is. You know, I could say a lot about why I think teaching is important, but there's only so much time. Well, I blew into New Zealand on the wings of a postdoc, there being no chance of philosophical employment in my native land, where Margaret Thatcher was taking an axe to education in general and philosophy in particular. I thought I was coming to a social democratic society in which I could, well, relax. By the time I'd gotten a permanent post, I realized that I was wrong. For the neoliberal revolution that was decimating social democratic institutions in my native land was running wild in New Zealand. Only this time, bizarrely, it was being led by the Labour Party. Deconstruction was the order of the day, and it was the institutions of the social democratic state that were being deconstructed. By 1990, the mixed economy, progressive income tax, free tertiary education, and the goal of full employment had all gone by the board. There weren't many state-owned enterprises left to sell, and though the flat taxes had lost the battle in 1988, as Jane Kelsey points out, they had effectively won the war. New Zealand was pretty close to a flat tax system. it was quite clear that the direction of government policy was incompatible with the fairer, more just society that was supposedly Labour's goal. Now, I wasn't a founder of the New Labour Party, but decided to join after the disastrous first conference held at the waterfront terminal. Having witnessed the craven behaviour of Labour's loyal left, I thought the New Labour Party was the only hope for social democratic politics in New Zealand. And having witnessed the attempted takeover by Trotskyists, I thought that the NLP needed my help. I wanted to defend in my new country the institutions that were being destroyed in my native land. Well, I'm off for time, by the way. Right. Just thinking I'm going to do it. Right? Well, to my mind, the function of the New Labour Party was clear: to slow down, stop, and eventually reverse the neoliberal revolution, to rebuild a social democratic state, somewhat amended to meet changed conditions. That was what I wanted out of the New Labour Party and subsequently the Alliance. Well, for 14 years, 1989 to 2003, I devoted a great deal of time, trouble, and effort to the NLP and the Alliance. It was a long story of struggle, with many defeats and a few very Pyrrhic victories. In the end, we did manage just about to slow down and stop, but not to reverse the neoliberal revolution. We did this chiefly by forcing Labour to the left in order to compete with us for the left-wing vote. Part of our problem, and I have former comrades here who can testify to this, part of our problem was that Jim Anderton, the party's leader, was simultaneously the greatest asset and the biggest liability. And it was never clear whether he was more of an asset or more of a liability. Once we were in office with Labour, he preferred to take this was, after the 1999 election, a softly approach to our coalition partners, never making a stand against their policies where we thought they were wrong, or in defence of our own values, preferring, as I put it, to do good by stealth within the confines of the cabinet room. This was losing us votes, and a majority of the party, partly at my urging, was considering the option of exiting the coalition and pursuing a more independent line in Parliament while supporting Labour on confidence and supply. Rather than giving up the seals of office, Anderton split the party, effectively destroying it. By the end of 2003, the Alliance was to all intents and purposes dead, and I had left it. My political life was over, and I could return to philosophy with new vim and vigour. Now, during those years, I devoted a lot of my leisure to politics, though I certainly worked full-time at my academic job. I should stress this, by the way. I don't consider electioneering as part of my job. For me, at least, lacking the demonic energy of some colleagues past and present, it's difficult to be an active researcher without working evenings and weekends. Thus, during and many of my weekends and evenings were devoted to politics. Thus, during this period, I was deferring to my inner Bismarck rather than indulging my philosophical addiction, and the consequence was that my research career slowed, if not to a crawl, then to a very sedate walk. Between 1996 and 2006, for instance, I did not publish a single journal article. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. During this period, 1989 to 2003, I published some of the seminal papers, I think I can honestly say this, on which my reputation rests. Their citations run into the hundreds. I became the world's leading expert on the ethics of Bertrand Russell. I edited a prize-winning collection of Russell's writings on ethics with a 30,000-word commentary by me. I organised a conference on no ought from is and moral motivation that eventually resulted in 2 books. Nonetheless, for me, they were years of relative research inactivity. The inner Bismarck was extracting a high price from the philosophy addict. But let's talk a bit about these papers from now on, focusing on the work rather than the life. Well, they fall into, I've written about quite a lot of stuff, but I'm just going to focus on some of the sort of key areas. The first set of papers deal with David Hume's famous dictum that you can't get an ought from an is, a moral conclusion from non-moral premises. This claim was widely taken to be gospel and was supposed to do wonders. In particular, it was supposed to establish a fundamental split between facts and values. But in 1960, the great New Zealand philosopher Arthur Pryor, perhaps Otago's most brilliant philosophical graduate to date, and we've had some pretty brilliant ones, I may add, proposed a tricky set of counterexamples. It seemed that by logic alone, nothing up your sleeve, right? Just logic, right? Just pure logic. You could derive ought claims from is claims, moral conclusions from non-moral premises. Now, my first thought was that these counterexamples were not just counterexamples to the claim that you can't get an ought from an is, but to the much more general thesis that in a logically valid argument, you don't get out what you haven't put in. That in a logically valid argument, the conclusion is somehow contained in the premises. So, I reformulated and proved a revised version of the containment thesis. If you have stuff, content in the conclusion of a logically valid inference, right, it's in the conclusion, it's not in the premises, then it will be vacuous in a certain sense. That means you can replace it with any old rubbish you like, and you'll still get a valid argument. Thus, and I stress I can prove this, in a logically valid argument, you can't get anything non-vacuous out that you haven't put in. A revised version of no ought from is follows as a special case. No non-vacuous ought from is. You can't get non-vacuous moral conclusions from non-moral premises. But, and here's the sort of perhaps the interesting point, though I have vindicated no ought from is, I have also trivialized it. The reason that you can't get a non-vacuous ought from an is you can't get conclusions in which any term appears non-vacuously in the conclusion, from premises from which it is absent. For instance, you can't get conclusions in which the word hedgehog appears non-vacuously in the conclusion unless the word hedgehog appears in the premises. No non-vacuous ought from is doesn't hold because of special features of the concept ought. It holds because in a logically valid argument, you can't get anything non-vacuous out that you haven't put in. So although my revised version of no ought from is not only true, but provably so, it doesn't, as many have thought, establish a fundamental split between fact and value. If there is such a split, it has to be argued on different grounds. So that's, I think, kind of interesting. A lot of people, I was at a seminar with The Economist just a couple of weeks ago. They were going on about no ought from is and drawing sort of fairly grand conclusions from this supposed truth. The grand conclusions don't follow. It's actually trivial. But its triviality itself is kind of important. Right? It's important that it's trivial. Right? It is trivial, but that it is trivial is kind of important. Right? All right. Now, as noted above, a lot of scholars on the humanities are deeply convinced that their research work isn't just a contribution to culture, but is in some sense socially useful. And often, not always of course, often they're deluded. But I rather hope that my work on conspiracy theories is an exception to this rule. Now, it's widely assumed that conspiracy theories as such are suspect, crazy, or unbelievable, and that conspiracy theorists are ipso facto crazy, dumb, or intellectually deficient. To call someone a conspiracy theorist is to suggest that they are several sandwiches short of the full picnic. And both conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist are widely used as terms of abuse. But if we define a conspiracy theory as a theory involving a conspiracy, a secret plan to influence events by partly secret means, this prejudice is absurd. Why? Because people frequently conspire, which means that a great many conspiracy theories are straightforwardly true. And B, that many conspiracy theorists are perfectly sensible, believing in or entertaining conspiracy theories that are true, plausible, or along the right lines. Right? You can be a rational conspiracy believer, even though the conspiracy theory you believe in isn't actually true, if it's the sort of thing that might happen. Right? And had Caesar been a conspiracy theorist with respect to the machinations of Brutus and Cassius, he would have been a lot better off. Conclusion: conspiracy theorists should not be dismissed en bloc simply because they are conspiracy theories. They should be considered on their merits. Now, many conspiracy theories, of course, are false, crazy, or unbelievable. But they're not false, crazy, or unbelievable because they're conspiracy theories. They're false, crazy, or unbelievable because they're false, crazy, or unbelievable. Why is this politically important? Because the idea that conspiracy theories as such are somehow suspect or unbelievable can be used by real-life conspirators to conceal their conspiratorial machinations from critical scrutiny, sometimes allowing them to get away with murder. Witness Bush, Blair, and their partisans who tended to brush aside allegations that crucial dossiers had been sexed up or that the threat of weapons of mass destruction had been exaggerated or manufactured. They dismissed such claims as conspiracy theories and therefore not worth considering, leading to a war which cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And very recently, this is just stuff I've been reading in the last few months, it's become clear that there's a link between my philosophical ideas on conspiracy theories and the struggle against both neoliberalism and climate change. The recent historical work of Naomi Oreskes and others has shown that to a surprising degree, at least in America, the neoliberal revolution and the campaign of climate change denial were conspiratorial affairs, or at least partly conspiratorial affairs, partly planned and partly executed in secret with front organizations, right? and things of that sort, carefully concealed funding from particular sources so as to give the impression, that they were just a bunch of intellectuals, whereas they were in fact a bunch of intellectuals being funded by fairly dark sources. Blind yourself to the reality of conspiracies by using conspiracy theory as a term of abuse, and you blind yourself to the processes which brought about the world that we live in. How am I for time now? Okay. I think I have more to say, but I can stop there. You've heard about my life and how I thought about it, and you've heard at least a little bit about my work. So I think I shall bring my presentation to a halt. Q&A. Questions, anybody? Who's got the mic? Anybody want to ask me anything? Or raise objections to some of my outlandish remarks? I thought I was saying plenty of controversial things, you know. Well, thank you. Right, well, we'll come back. You can confirm that, Marvin, if your recollections. I'm talking to Marvin, who's an old comrade of mine from the Alliance and New Labour Party. Mike.
Charles, if you see good and bad with the same clarity that you see black and white, won't you finally change your mind and be a moral realist?
So say that again?
If you see good and bad with the same clarity that you see black and white, can't you just change your mind? Be a moral realist.
Well, the problem is, I'm deeply convinced that it isn't true, right? Moral realism for the audience, that's the view that one, moral judgments are in the true-false game, and two, that substantial numbers of them are true because there really are moral facts for moral judgments to correspond to. So, could I change my mind? Well, not without violating my philosophical conscience. I might be, as it were, being true to the sort of little boy who wants to do his bit, but I wouldn't be true to the philosophical addict that I became at age 20. Grant.
Do you think there is a natural or given by nature form of life for human beings which is a good form of life?
Okay, right. Do I think that there is a good form of life that is given by nature? No. Basically, no. I don't think that. To answer that at length would require sort of going in detail in my critique of both the concept of an attributive good, which you're probably appealing to, yeah, right, and also to the idea that human beings have a function. We don't, or at least if we do, it's so vague and open-ended that almost anything anybody might do will count as fulfilling the human function. You know, I mean anything, including terrible things, right? You're not failing to be a human being by massacring your opponents. You're being, by my lights, a really bad human being, but this is a human thing to do.
A finger on that.
Okay,
Does the same non-evaluative judgment apply to our means of getting where we get to?
Okay, well, again, this would require a longer answer, right? And I'm giving people the bare bones of my theory. But, so going back to the word good, right? I think the word good can be used, it's not ambiguous. There's a range of related meanings, right? So it's not that it's just this kind of good over here and this kind of good over there, and there's nothing connecting them between them, right? But in some contexts, good can be used naturalistically. It can mean something like this is a good X means something like this is an X which fulfills the requirements on X or does what X's are supposed to do. And then those requirements are in some sense natural requirements, like the means to an end. But good also is used in a non-natural sense when you're suggesting not merely that something is the means to the end, but the end is in some sense right. And I can say this to Grant, right? Because he's a philosopher. I do write about this in my article, Geach on Good, where I basically deal with this problem at length. And I wrote that a long time ago, I think 1988. Right. I've got one from Marvin and then James. Marvin's here.
don't you think that somebody who believes that the universe is productive of life and in its way good, and maybe even productive of information and intelligence, is useful and produces people like Martin Luther King or Russell, and is much more productive, say, than Nietzsche's philosophy?
Okay, my answer...
These cannot be proven.
Right. Okay, now here's what I'd say to that, Marvin. This is a more general response, right, perhaps your question. But, look, the fact that I don't think that morality is, as it were, written into the nature of things doesn't mean that I don't have a morality, right? And that I can't evaluate things in terms of my morality. It's just I don't think these things are ultimately justified. So I can say things like, well, I much prefer the morality of Martin Luther King to, let's say, the morality of Nietzsche. Right? I can say that. But what I can't say is that Martin Luther King is absolutely good and Nietzsche is absolutely bad.
Oh,
right?
I would agree.
Written to the nature of things. And I don't mean just that everybody's got a bit of good or bad or evil. I mean the standards, right? I'm talking about the standards. And there's somebody I haven't mentioned here, which, you know, to whom I would like to pay tribute, which is Jim Flynn.
Oh, yes.
And as you know, many of you are probably aware, you know, Jim has had a book called How to Defend Humane Ideals. And what that book was about was saying, well, all right, there's no objective morality. Nonetheless, here are strategies that I can use to defend a humane ethic. Right? And if you want to find out about that, you can either read his book or read or view my In Conversation with Jim Flynn, which is, you know, on YouTube, so, where we discuss this very issue. James. Oh, no, somebody else.
Hi, Charles. I'm just thinking about the good and bad. Could we not say that it's a good to resist destroying the means of our very existence?
Well, you can say it.
Would you say it?
And I can say it in a
sense. You care
sense.
about it a lot.
I don't think there's, you know, an objective requirement that the human race should continue to exist. I'm inclined to say if it didn't, that would be rather a pity, but, you know, there's not an objective requirement there.
On
so,
what grounds
you
then
know,
do you feel like you've perhaps failed?
Sorry?
On what grounds then do you say you've perhaps
Well, you know, the failure is with respect to a set of requirements which I kind of adopted. So, you know, I was a little boy and I read, you know, this book about the history of the 20th century and all the terrible things that had happened, and at the end was somebody saying, to the intelligent child like me, we're handing it over to you. And I kind of accepted the mission, you know, insofar as it's reasonable to do so. And I'm of the view that we made a terrible mess of things given my vague standards.
Hi, Charles.
Hi, James.
So I like what you say about conspiracy theorists. It's clearly true. There are real conspiracies. And conspiracy theorist seems a far too strong a term that we can sling around with gay abandon. But I worry that there's a sort of intellectual vice. So imagine that I'm the sort of person who is so wedded to my views, I desperately want something to be true. There's no evidence for that thing. So I claim that there's evidence for it that I don't know about. We go looking for it. Nobody finds it. Now I'm claiming that people are hiding it. It's part of a conspiracy. That seems like a risky way for me to be and a risky thing for me to be in the community. What are we going to call people like me, if not conspiracy theorists?
Okay, I'm going to call you bad conspiracy theorists. But look, because remember, this is a sort of short presentation, I've got a paper in which I discuss what are the features of a bad conspiracy theory. And also, I'm writing a paper on the intellectual vices characteristic of bad conspiracy theorists. So one of the things that makes a conspiracy theory a bad one, likely to be false, is that it posits a conspiracy from which it's easy to defect, right? It's easy to defect from this alleged conspiracy, and there have been no defections, right? That kind of conspiracy theory is suspect. More generally, and here I make a concession to the person that I started off opposing. It's a slight concession, but it is a concession. Look, there is an intellectual vice characteristic of, I think, some conspiracy theorists. And what it basically is always looking for the explanation of a bad thing happening in terms of the intentions of bad agents. Now, this isn't a theory, right? It's just a thing people tend naturally to do. And they do it also in the context of non-conspiratorial thinking. So, I had, on one of the philosophy blogs, there was a suggestion that the reason that citations in philosophy are like this, there's a high, narrow spire and a long, flat, with lots of people few people getting a lot of citations and lots of people getting hardly any. And the explanation of this was, it's all bad old philosophers not citing young people. That's the explanation. No, that's not the explanation. It's an invisible hand effect. What happens is more stuff is produced than anybody can read, so everybody has to adopt strategies to ration their intake of philosophy, right, if they're professional philosophers. And what sort of strategies do you adopt? What sort of strategies everybody adopt? They read stuff they have reason to believe is good because it's done by somebody who's produced good stuff. Right? Everybody's doing this. And the consequence is that a few people who are reliable producers get massive numbers of citations, and quite a lot of people who might be just as good but haven't been shown to be so get hardly any at all. So it's an invisible hand effect. It's a winner-takes-all sort of thing. And my talking about winner-takes-all effect and invisible hands, this is one of the things that you really get from doing PPE. You think in these terms. Lots of people don't. They don't apply it to themselves either, right? But, the invisible hand could be lifting you up or swatting you down, right? Invisible hand mechanisms are real, as are hidden hand or conspiratorial mechanisms. They both operate in human history. Okay.
Well, good evening, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Jessica Palmer. I am a manakura o Te Kite Aranui, so the PVC of the humanities. And it's my pleasure to close the evening and to formally thank Charles for his address. Strict instructions from him not to say much at all because the Q&A was far more important, and I think we appreciated that, so thank you, Charles. But I do want to abuse my privilege and say two things. So the first one is that I think what we saw in front of us was a demonstration of exactly what Zach commended you on earlier, that you encouraged younger scholars by asking hard questions, by deeply and enthusiastically committing to an inquiry. And what I loved about what you did tonight was you did that to yourself. There's a sense of you're not being entirely happy with where you stand on particular issues. And that is the academic endeavour. So thank you, Charles. And secondly, I guess I wanted to note the irony that the two bookends of this evening represent the evil of university management. So the DVC research starts us off and the PVC humanity ends it. But I think it's appropriate to recognise that. Many of you will know that internally within this university, Charles has played a really important and really valued role in trying to call out things that he is not happy about. And unfortunately, because he ran out of time, he didn't get to talk about a couple of those roles, but he does mention in the written version his sense of failure, ask examples of failure, one of them being his failure on council. And I just want to take a moment to say, as the PVC and often as the recipient of all staff emails that Charles can send out every so often when he feels very strongly about an issue, I want to commend you for that. I don't think you've been a failure at all. I can understand a sense of failure, you haven't been able to achieve everything you'd hoped to achieve in that role. But it's really important in this university community that we continue to listen to each other and engage. And so I want to commend you as someone sitting in university management and someone who inevitably you end up battling with on certain issues, that you are an important part of this community and you have not been a failure on many fronts at all, and to thank you for that and to affirm you for that. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I certainly have. It remains for me to invite you over to the staff club to celebrate with Charles and his family, to share refreshments with them, and to congratulate him on his achievement and his many achievements alongside failures. And failures are not all bad. So a huge thank you from me and from the university leadership, and a congratulations to you, Charles, on a professorship well deserved. Kia ora.